Dr. James Marten, Professor Emeritus of History at Marquette University, is here. James has authored more than 20 books, it's my understanding, but...
edited. They were all on.
Okay. And primarily, the topic is, your topic is Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty exciting, pretty interesting, and especially tailored to Appleton. So, welcome, James, and we'll let you take over. Feel free, if you have any questions, don't be afraid to ask, okay?
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, it's great to be here. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the book as a whole, but since Wisconsin came from all over Wisconsin, and so it's been kind of fun to identify the 8 counties that provide kernels of the first 10 companies of race. And so I'm giving talks a little bit here and there, around the state. I can kind of design things around those places. So first I'll sort of do an overview, and then I'll kind of focus in on Appleton. By the end of September 1862, the surgeon's report of the sick and wounded, this is a monthly report that surgeons had to do, the regimental doctors had to do. They had a form they filled out. There had to be about 200 different things they could check off. So there are 10 guys that had dysentery, 12 guys that had measles or whatever. But in the end of September of 1862, he had one thing that he checked. It was bolus scopleticum. They do this in Latin for some reason, which is Latin for gunshot wound. The 6th Wisconsin had 212 cases of gunshot wounds, 40 deaths, out of about 650 or so men that were still with the regiment. This is the month in which they had fought 4 battles in about 5 weeks. This is the first battles they fought, actually. We'll get to the battles in a little bit. But it ended with Antietam, which is, if you're well, you've heard of Antietam, certainly. Second Manassas is part of that South Mountain in their first battle. Of those casualties in the 6 weeks of brutal combat, there were 4 killed and 11 wounded from Outagamie County. How do you say Outagamie? Is that how you say it? I've seen it. I've never had to say it out loud before.
Originally, it was Outagamie.
Okay.
But currently, today, it's Outagamie.
Outagamie. Okay. I'm not going to say it again, but okay, got it. And it must have belonged to Company E. So I'm going to focus on Company E, which is Appleton and Fondle, is what the original guys came from. So first, a sense of the whole book. So this is, picture is, you might know already, the 6th Wisconsin was part of the Iron Brigade, which is one of the most famous brigades in the war. A brigade is 4 or 5 regiments. So at its height, a regiment had 1,000 men, a company had 100 men, there were 10 companies in a regiment. The Iron Brigade was the 2nd, 7th, and 6th Wisconsin, and the 19th Indiana at first. Look at the gentleman's T-shirt with all the names. That's the Iron Brigade. This is 5th Corps symbol adapted to the Iron Brigade. They added the 24th Michigan a little bit later. This is actually their unique uniform. They weren't the only ones wearing these. The old Army uniforms. This is not what you usually see with Union Army soldiers. They had caps. They had different kinds of coats. But the Iron Brigade, because of their first main commander, John Gibbon, who was an old Army officer himself, had them wear and distinctively they had the tall hats. Sometimes the Confederates called them the Black Hat Brigade or the Black Hats. And they're turned out because they've given away your gun if you were fighting otherwise. This is actually the 2nd Wisconsin. I don't have any super pictures of the 6th. Standing in the uniforms, but that's part of the Iron Brigade as well. This is their battle flag, their 2nd battle flag. The first one, I think, is at the Veterans Museum in Wisconsin, but it's all torn up from the first battle. You see, they always stitched in battles they fought at on one of the stripes. So you can see they were, once they started fighting in August '62, they were in virtually every battle fought, well, in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. During that time. Ultimately, they came from over 400 counties. About 2,000 guys served in the regiment altogether, never at one time. The most they'll ever have is 1,000, and they will be down to 700 without firing a shot, disease and other things ate into them. Ultimately, 155, I don't even read my PowerPoint slide to you, but they had very heavy casualties. The Iron Brigade itself, the 5 regiments that served in it, suffered the most casualties of any brigade in the Union Army throughout the war. And the 6th Wisconsin actually had fewer than, I think, the other regiments, slightly. It's still in the top or bottom, however you want to think about it, 100 regiments in terms of casualties. But over half of men in 6th Wisconsin either were killed in battle, wounded in battle, or discharged for illness and disability. And an unusual thing, over a majority of their casualties were, in fact, combat casualties. Most war regiments, it was mainly disease. And so that's a really big overview. I mentioned they came from 400 towns and cities, but the original 10, well, there were 10 companies, the original volunteers that went into the regiment in the summer of 1861. As soon as Fort Sumter occurs in April 1961, meetings are held all over the North, but certainly in Wisconsin. And I'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute. But they start recruiting the first 6 regiments in Wisconsin immediately. And those first 6 regiments are all either headed for Virginia or just like Tennessee or Southern Illinois or something like that by July. And that's when the 6th Wisconsin goes to Virginia. Another regiment will go in. They're numbered in the order in which they show up at Camp Randall, pretty much, or Western Pacific. And so the 400 towns and cities, they expand because there are about 250 more enlistees over the course of the war. They have 475 drafted men. Now, again, if you know about the Civil War, you know that's an incredibly high number. It's 1% of all the draftees in the Union Army. When the 6th Wisconsin, had no idea why. It's far more than any other Wisconsin regiment. And I just have no idea what was going on that caused that to occur. And they're from all over the place as well. And so the initial kernels of companies coming from a few towns within one county, that changes completely when there's a completely different regiment by the end of the war. 30 guys serve all 4 years. And so it's a real turnover. And that's actually one of the main themes of the book. And so here's some of the other ones. And so this is an academic book, although there's a lot of stories in it. I mean, I think there's a narrative element to this, I think, that makes it pretty accessible. And so some of the main things, I talked about the evolution of the regiment, and that's what I was just talking about. It really changed a lot. The officer corps completely turns over, not literally, but almost virtually. There's 50 substitutes, men that are paid to take somebody else's place if they are drafted. But I also talked about the changing nature of combat. Now, all combat is pretty grim, very hard. But early in the war, the 6th Wisconsin and other regiments like it know exactly what they're doing in the battle. They knew what they did, how they did it, what their contribution was, even if they had lost the battle. And we'll talk a little bit about them in a minute. By the end of the war, from summer of 1864 on, they have no clue what's going on. Especially when the draftees come in, they really know what's going on. A lot of them speak German, don't really speak English. Draftees are, maybe half of them are German immigrants. About a third of the regiment as a whole are. And I have some letters from a guy from Sheboygan, actually. And since you know he survives, they're kind of entertaining. But you just talk about running back and forth, not really knowing what the point of battle is. And that's kind of how everybody thinks about, you may have heard of Spotsylvania or the Wilderness and the Siege of Petersburg. There's kind of a cog in the machine. And so the nature of combat changes a great deal over the course of the war. The title of the book, and I'm sure it's been mentioned, it's called The 6th Wisconsin and the Long Civil War, the Biography of a Regiment. And by long Civil War, that's something historians have talked about for a while, and my definition is not what some historians use. Mine is very common sense. The war didn't end for these guys with the shooting stop. And so at least, 40% of the book is really about them after the war. And I'll get to a couple of guys from Appleton, they're post-war lives as well. And so I talk about health, I talk about memory, I talk about commemoration, but just the long Civil War. And what I mean by the biography of Regiment, this isn't a regimental history, this is a regimental biography. Because I treat it as an organic being, basically. It is born, they gather, it lives, it dies, and is remembered afterwards. I don't end with this guy, but the last guy that I know for sure that belonged to the regiment died in 1939 in the soldiers' home in Milwaukee. And so I do a lot with memory that I'm not going to go into so much tonight. So that's what I mean by the long Civil War and by biography in the title. So a lot of this is about the post-war, which I've done a lot. We've done a lot of work about veterans, Civil War veterans. And so that's what I was most familiar with when I was working on this. And then I do talk about memory, the life cycle of memory, the stories the soldiers told, the organizations they formed, the Grand Army of the Republic, you may have heard of as kind of the American Legion for Civil War soldiers, memorials to them, put up by them to comrades or cities or organizations creating them. And also I did a thing with obituaries, which were very interesting to read. So I talk about how soldiers remember themselves and how they want to be remembered, but also how the communities remember them as well when they pass. And so this is a sampling of sort of the big themes that go throughout the book that might be interesting. One of the things that I have here is my methodology. And so what's interesting about this is that I started working this 9 years ago, this summer. And I was at Gettysburg on a walk with a friend on the Gettysburg Cemetery, Gettysburg battlefield. And I was looking for a new project and I wanted to do something about Wisconsin. I'm not from Wisconsin, but I lived here for a long time. And one thing led to another, and we were walking out west of Gettysburg, where the 6th Wisconsin, and I'll show you a picture of it in a minute, fought one of its most famous parts of the battle, the unfinished railroad cut. It's a finished railroad cut now, trains still run through it. It's where the main monument for 6th Wisconsin is. It's really the only monument they have in a battlefield. They don't have any markers, but this is a big monument with that picture on it, with the Maltese cross adapted is part of it. And I decided, well, I'm going to do something a little bit different. And what I ended up doing is this is my spreadsheet for part of it. For the 2,000 guys that served in 6th Wisconsin, there's 24 data points. And I suppose there were two main young women that were RAs for me, but other students as well, looking through Ancestry.com and newspapers, and finding this kind of stuff about them. Now, this takes the birth and death, their company, their rank in, rank out, the year they got a pension. Did they join the GAR? What was their occupation before the war and after the war? Were they married? Who did they get married? How many kids did they have? Did they move after the war? Were they in a soldier's home? I will never say that all these things are absolutely correct. They are certainly minimums, I think, in terms of, I found, for instance, like 35% of my guys, and they're my guys, and working for nine years, joined the GAR or the Iron Brigade Association or did something else. That's kind of low. You kind of imagine there being a lot more guys joining the organizations. So that's a minimum. But still, a majority of soldiers do not belong to a veterans organization, which is I think a somewhat, in a minor way, surprising thing for them. But this becomes the basis for a lot of the long Civil War notion. And this notion of a biography. I have 2,000 biographies here, in a way. Now, sometimes I just have an occupation and age and date of death because they were 18 when they joined up and they got killed at Gainesville, the first battle. Or some of the draftees just kind of disappear sometimes. I don't know why. I have no substitutes especially. Just kind of can't find them after 1870. So census reports are a lot of what I see. Have any of you done much in Ancestry? Yeah, I mean, you know the kinds of documents you get, and if you work really hard, and you can tell just between John Smith the 8,000 John Smiths. We didn't actually have a John Smith, I don't think, but there are a lot, and they're spelled wrong. These German names that they're doing it in a noisy camp in Camp Randall, and they're doing it out loud. The Germans can't speak English. The officers can't speak German, and whatever they put down. And so you have to kind of work through that. But it ended up being a pretty good data spreadsheet. I also looked at about 350 pension files. I'll talk about pension in a little bit. And that provided another kind of narrative. Because when you apply for a pension, you're not just saying, well, checking and doing a checklist. You are writing a narrative of your life since you got wounded or mainly got sick. And convincing a pension bureau that, in fact, you deserve a $4 a month pension or $12 if you're really sick pension. And you get renewals and so forth. Then it takes 2 or 3 years often to get them. And a pension file can have anywhere from 50 pages, which is little, to 250. And there are forms and there are letters and affidavits and insertions. They're all sorting out before a county clerk or a judge or judge of the peace that they're telling the truth. And there's also different times say, yes, this person is who he says it is, and this and that and the other thing. Widows proving that they actually were married to the soldiers, that their children were actually their children. They haven't married again. They haven't living in sin with someone else. It's really intrusive and hard. And they had pension agents that help them with it. But anyway, the pension files are really narratives of post-war lives. And I'm going to talk about Joseph Marten's post-war life in a little bit through his pension file. But that provided a lot of information for the spreadsheet. So I'll stop boring you with spreadsheets. Well, I'm sure you'd love to hear more of the spreadsheets.
There's some Appleton guys on there, so.
Were there? I didn't know what I had on there.
They're quite
What was
cute.
that?
There's Levi Randall, Briar Randall.
Oh, yeah.
Marston.
Yeah, Marston.
Oh, that's just I just pulled out a page. Yeah.
Yeah, it was, and Ransom Law. Yeah, there's a lot on that one.
Yeah. Wow. There's only like 40 guys. So, basic facts about Company E and Oregami. Is that right?
Oregami.
That's how it's spelled. I don't know why I can't do that. So 65 in the 6th Wisconsin. 60 were enlisted, 4 were drafted, 1 was a substitute. 36 from Company E, which is by far the most in any company, so that's why I'm focusing on that. Overall, in all companies, 7 were killed in action, 4 died of disease, 1 was missing, presumed dead, 14 wounded, 11 discharged for other disabilities. 57% of them were casualties of one kind or another, which is very high even until the Civil War. 10 were immigrants, 3 from Holland, 3 from Ireland, although 1 of them was born at sea. I always got a kick out of that when you see that. I think they were from Ireland. 22 were married when they went into the Army. In terms of occupations in 1860, 22 were farmers or living with their families as on farms or farm laborers. Several were laborers, 2 painters, a shoemaker, a saloon keeper, a mason, a machinist, a lumberman, a printer, a chair maker. Was that a big deal in Appleton? Was there a chair factory? Yeah, there are a lot of chair guys that end up working there eventually. 2 clerks and 3 students from Lawrence, I believe. Post-war occupations, I know like about 60% of the guys' post-war occupations. These changed over the years, of course, but 12 farmers, a grocer, post office, 3 of them worked in post offices, probably because they were veterans, they got government jobs, basically. A bank cashier, publisher of the Fund like Commonwealth, a land speculator, a lawyer, a liveryman, dry goods, and a failed saloon keeper who then called himself a capitalist. What he did. Of the 40 that we know for sure of the survivors lived someplace, 26 stayed in Wisconsin for sure, majority in Outagamie County. Others moved around. I'm going to stop saying it now. I can't improve on that. Other places in Wisconsin or Missouri, California, Michigan, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, Washington, Indiana, they moved west. And this is a famous part of veteranhood after the war, especially the Plain States, is that they moved there. At least 23, the 53 survivors received pensions, probably more. I just haven't come across the year they got them. And 2 lived in veterans' homes. Alonzo Gifford died in it was called the National Home for Disabled Voluntary Soldiers, which is along the way playing Soldiers Home in Milwaukee. And then another one lived in the California Veterans Home. It's how they refer to it as probably the NHDVS branch in, I think it's Santa Monica, Santa Barbara, I think is where it is, in California. And at least 18 belonged to the GAR or attended Iron Brigade reunions every year. So those are the facts about the Company E in 6th Wisconsin. Well, I first talk about gathering. I get a notion of how Company E came together. Its first name was called Bragg's Rifles. Edward Bragg was a lawyer from Fond du Lac. And he's putting together a company at the same time that folks in Appleton are putting together their own companies. Bragg was a 24-year-old lawyer, married, had a couple of kids. At the war meeting in Fond du Lac, and again, all these little towns have war meetings when the war was starting. He gave a very short speech, which is kind of his way. I really like Edward Bragg. He had looked a murder trial that he was the lawyer for to attend this meeting. And he said, "I cannot do as others have done. I offer you money. I bequeath my loved ones to your protection and will go myself." He concluded his speech with, "This is no time for vain vaporing. All who are ready to fight, sign this muster roll with me." He slammed it down. Company was formed and chose him as captain. And that wasn't official yet, but he's going to be their leader, and they'll start getting them drilled, getting ready to be called to Madison, where these particular companies are going. Meanwhile, in Appleton, a war meeting was held featuring 30 vice presidents. I think they're all guys that have businesses and want to feel like they're really part of it, which resulted in a long list of resolutions. I'm going to read some of them. They were really full of themselves in this particular meeting, and they're really into it. Resolved that we, the union-loving people of the city of Appleton, hereby pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor in defense of the rights and liberties of the United States of America, that we deem it our privilege as well as our bounden duty to uphold the pure principles of our Republican government, to maintain the rights of each citizen in person and property, to uphold our banner, the stars and stripes. And it kind of goes on and on. And that's only part of what I actually have here. It's only part of what they actually published in the Crescent a couple days later. We recommend to the city councils to take such measures as in their wisdom and patriotism shall be deemed expedient to provide the necessities of the families. All these resolutions always include taking care of families. Ease the burden on the soldiers going off. We'd be worried about their families. And so several companies in Appleton started to form, including these Silver Grays, made up of men over 45. They would act as the home guard and take the field. I don't know if they ever really did any of that stuff. 45 was when the draft started in the North. I think 48 was the high age to register. Now, most draftees weren't that old. Although draftees are much older than enlistees. Enlistees are like 23 in 6 Wisconsin. Draftees are 35 on average. So the more established have families that formed because they're kind of waiting, maybe they don't get drafted, and then they didn't. And so there was another company called the Appleton Invincibles. Very common name for a company being formed north and south. And there were a number of other companies and other regiments in which men from Appleton and I screwed up, man. I said I was going to try it again. Outagamie. Also went into. But one company called the Appleton Guards had to disband. 30 of them were snapped up by a recruiter from Chicago, but the rest, about 40, joined Bragg's Rifles. In return, their leader, Joseph Marston, was voted first lieutenant in the combined Company E. He would end up taking Bragg's place as captain. He was the captain for much of the war of Company E. The Appleton contingent of Company E left home in late June, later on the southbound train to Madison. They and a large number of citizens gathered. Again, this is very common early in the war. You have a going away reception, really, for them. The volunteers received numerous gifts, some more practical than others. The newspaper reported that they Got a copy of the New Testament and a package containing useful articles, such as towels, socks, needle books. This was a very popular thing in little sewing kits to soldiers. Also, he bore off a large and very tastefully arranged bouquet of flowers from the hands of the patriotic ladies of Appleton. A brass band led them to the depot. Their captain, Marten, was again, he's not captain, he's lieutenant, but he's their captain, was already giving orders. He called them a line, although the mob made it hard to get much progress getting into line, get ready to get on the train. The Appleton motor wrote, "There are so many to impede their progress with a firm grasp of the hand, accompanied by words of cheer and a fervent wish for their prosperity. A Godspeed or the silent pressure of the hand by some who were too deeply affected to give utterance to their feelings. It was truly affecting to witness friends part with friends, wives and mothers part with their husbands and sons, as they imagined, as it may prove the last time. But on every occasion they were entreated to do their duty, that they were called to battle, to rely on the God who battles for protection, success, and a righteous cause in which they have enlisted." Very typical kind of way of describing these goodbyes. I've seen dozens of these as individuals or groups of men lead towns. A very specific goodbye was published by a man named W.C. Cook, who's a local man. He writes, "Friends and fellow citizens," a card. And he buys a little ad, basically, in the newspaper. Out of game. "Many of you have asked me how I could go to war and could not see how I could lead. Duty calls and tells me that now there is an opportunity afforded me to assist in the preservation of this, the best of all governments in Christendom. As most of you are aware, my health would not permit me to enter the ranks." And so he joins the band, although he doesn't really show up in the band, so I'm not really sure what the scoop is with that, but he's going into the band to begin with. "It seems to me that everyone, man and woman, has a duty to perform, that it is not honorable or becoming the name of an American citizen to sit here quietly and look upon this matter, not letting our courage go farther than the post office or a newspaper, hoping that it may be settled through the energy and blood of our neighbors. All that I ask is that you, my friends and fellow citizens, look to what I have left behind and see that you do by them as you would yours should be done by in like circumstances. And if I can be satisfied that the sound of my horn," he's in the band, remember, "has incited one sole action victory, I am content." He's tried to settle his accounts and business. He says, "Goodbye, W.C. Cook." And, of course, he's killed in Antietam. He's one of the 4 guys killed up in Company E. You seen the Ken Burns Civil War series? This is like the letter that ends the first episode, after your first school run. I just saw that as I was reading it this time. Yeah, I read that one out loud before, so you sort of get a sense more of what's going on there. And I've seen little ads bought by businessmen saying my accounts will take care of some very practical things. I've not seen just a common soldier writing this long paragraph about leaving. So let's get on to the war. So there's Edward Bragg. He will be captain of Company E until by spring of 1862, he's major. Actually, he's lieutenant colonel of the regiment. He's second in command of the regiment. Marston's taking over about that time, I believe. On the upper left is Joseph Marston. That's the same picture right there. The guy in the lower left, the guy in the middle is just a great picture of a soldier, worthy Pat. I'm not going to talk to him at all, but he's from Appleton. His brother went off together. That's Jerome Waltrix, who is now famous in Appleton. He came from, he's a newspaper guy, worked at Crescent before the war. He's mainly famous in Milwaukee, but because he came from Appleton, I'm going to talk to him later on too. So we'll end up talking about Marston and Waltrix as sort of examples of the long Civil War. But there's the Bragg I've been talking about, and I find him to be really interesting. So the companies are gathering. I think in general, they get their letters. Company E is the 5th company that arrived in Camp Randall, from the 6th Wisconsin. Company K is the last. And they stumble in late June rather. The State Journal, which was kind of the newspaper of record, for Wisconsin then, tracked all the companies coming in. So Bragg's Rifles, hail from Fond du Lac. And the captain, E.S. Bragg, is well known as a prominent lawyer of that city. He has all the ability and real nerve necessary. They did this for every company, every regiment coming into Camp Randall. To make a very superior officer, and if necessary, he will give a little more grape. That's the kind of cannon shot with a will. This company has been organized and for some time and has made up the best kind of material that will do honor to the state. Every company coming in has made the best kind of material according to the State Journal. Some companies are lumbermen from the Northwest, as we'll talk about the flannel shirts and how tough they are. And some are rivermen from Prescott, up near the river. And so there's real variety. But there's variety in terms of as varied as you can be among young white men in Wisconsin. They're very different. They're very diverse in that sense. The first death in the regiment, and so they trained Camp Randall after First Bull Run, the disaster there. They and the 5th Wisconsin, 5th goes first, the 6th goes a few days later, are sent to Virginia in August of 1861. The first death in the regiment was actually a comrade in company, a guy from, he wasn't from Appleton, but he was in Company E. And he was, they were changing trains in Chicago. He hurt his foot. They got back on the train, went to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He died in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania of an accident, received on the way to the war. And so that's the first death in the 6th Wisconsin. One of the, it's funny that this W.C. Cook mentioned me in the band, because the 6th Wisconsin band was famously bad. People talked about it at the time. And November of 1961, they're disbanded. They just get rid of them. And in fact, there's something called the descriptive role, which I won't go into all, but never mind. There's a source I have. It's a big book like this. You open it in the Wisconsin Historical Society. And every man has a long line. It's kind of like my spreadsheet. It's like an 1888 style spreadsheet. There's a lot of information about enlistments and things like that. There's also notes over here about when they're in the hospital, when they were on leave, things like that. A few of them said dismissed for incompetence. They couldn't play their instruments, I guess. Some of them ended up in other units. Some just stayed in Company E, like Cook. Cook's not mentioned as one of the ones that are dismissed. But it's kind of this funny thing. Now, in the end, the brigade has a very good band. And if you know of the reenactment band, the 1st Brigade Band, which plays in Wisconsin, less so than they used to, I think, but they still exist. I think they're named after the Iron Brigade Band. And so I want to talk a little bit about sort of the battle narratives. Only 4 of the 1861 recruits from Outagamie County in Company served throughout the war. I think we kind of think of they gather, they serve, they come home. And ones that don't get killed come home. Well, most of them come home long before the war ends. They're discharged, again, for illness or other reasons. None of them deserted. Wisconsin has very few deserters. Far, far, far fewer than most regiments. But those that lasted fought in some of the biggest battles of war. So just a little glimpse of the battle. So this is Gainesville. It's the first battle. It's fought August 28th, 1862. This is from the Union side. If you're a Civil War buff, you might know the name Edward Waugh, who is one of the most famous sketch artists and paintings as well after the war. You'll have seen this. He did this. And so the far side is the Confederates. This is Stonewall Jackson's man. He has about 10 or 12,000 men on the line or a mile or two behind the line. And in effect, they ambush the Western Brigade, as it's called. It's not the Iron Brigade yet. And they fight for 90 minutes in gathering dark. This is the 6th Wisconsin going into battle. All the numbers, he has certain things labeled, so he says who's doing what. And this is a knockdown, drag-out fight in the dark. They all comment on seeing both lines for the muzzle flashes. They don't do anything fancy. They just shoot each other for 90 minutes, about 50 to 70 yards apart. Then the fire just kind of peters out. And then the Union force, vastly outnumbered Union force, just retreats back through some woods and picks up their wounded and keeps on going. They fight the next day at Second Manassas, Second Bull Run, where they don't have a huge part to play there, so they don't have a lot of casualties at Second Bull Run. Another disaster for the Union forces. They cover their retreat as the Army moves backward toward Washington. Their next big battle is actually South Mountain in Maryland, where they are attacking Confederates who are holding certain mountain passes. This is not it. But at South Mountain is where the Iron Brigade gets its name, the Iron Brigade. They advance up the mountain against pretty heavy fire. George McClellan, who was their commander at the time, sees this. Some general asks him, "So what do you think of my brigade now?" And he says, "They fought like iron." And within 2 weeks, they're called the Iron Brigade. That's the first time I see it in a newspaper, at least. This is Antietam. This is a painting by some French guy, something famous. That's not a nice way to refer to him, but it is. From the 1880s. And it's just called Antietam. And he doesn't say it's in 6th Wisconsin, but this thing happened in 6th Wisconsin. So that very early in the battle, it's like 6:30 in the morning. Doesn't look that way from the light. That's the Dunkard Church. Again, you know about Antietam, that's kind of a big part of the battlefield. I'm pretty sure this is meant to be Bragg here in the back, or John Gibbon, the brigade commander by that time. But a single cannonball explodes just above Company A, and 2 guys are killed and 11 guys are wounded. This one shot. And everyone comments on it. They're clearly in the brigade because most of them have these hats. They have the white gaiters. That's another thing. They hated the white gaiters. They had to wear, around their ankles. It's white leggings. And so this is probably the 6th Wisconsin when this happened. And Antietam, again, if you know anything about that battle, you know the cornfield. You've been to the Veterans Museum in Madison? That life-size diorama is Rufus Dawes in the 6th Wisconsin coming through the cornfield, which is one of the bloodiest parts of this very, very bloody battle. And so this ends the fighting for the 6th, pretty much, for the fall of 1862. And it's this point at which the surgeon makes his report about the gunshot wounds. And probably having gone to Virginia with 1,000 guys in August of 1861, by the end of September 1862, there are probably 300 guys that are reporting for you. Now, some will come back. They're in hospital. They'll be on leave, but they'll come back. But numbers of people in the regiment will be about that much for the next year or two, with some coming and going, a few more enlistees come in, and so forth. So I do want to give you some glimpses of the home front. So all of this is going on. Oh, that's a whole different thing. I'm sorry, this is a great story. I skipped battle. This is Battle of Chancellorsville, only it's their part of it. They were not in the main Battle of Chancellorsville in May 1863, which again is another huge disaster for the Union Army. They, however, had a great day. This is a painting of the 6th Wisconsin with parts of a couple other regiments attacking across the Rappahannock River in order for a bridge to be built. So this is an amphibious attack across a very wide river with Confederates in what we call them foxholes, rifle pits, we call it at the time, firing at them the entire time. It's one of my favorite ever Bragg moments. They're given this assignment. The boats they're using are the pontoon boats, kind of wide, heavy, clumsy things that they used to build the bridge. They put planks over them to build the bridges. So they're not great boats. You've seen the longest day, the bridge too far. It's like them going, Robert Redford leading the guys across on the bridge too far. But they're kind of behind the bluff, and it's time to go. And Bragg goes, "Let's go." And that's all they do. That's the only order he gives. And they lose a few men, but they storm the rifle pits. They capture 20 Confederates. The bridge is built, never used. The battle's lost. They go back over it again. But this is one of their favorite moments. It's really dramatic. They do a great job. They know exactly what their contribution was, and they did it by themselves. So they really like it. That's what they like about it. And then this is the moment at Gettysburg that I mentioned before. But this time, Bragg misses Gettysburg. He got kicked by a horse. He's in Washington having that taken care of. So the guy with the wooden sword there is Rufus Dawes. And we know about 6th Wisconsin mainly because he wrote one of the best memoirs by any junior officer. He comes to colonel of the 6th, but he's first captain of Company K from Juneau County. I can say Juneau. I don't know. Anyway, becomes major before the first battle. He actually leads the regiment at Antietam because Bragg is wounded mildly, and he leads the regiment at Gettysburg. And this is the unfinished railroad cut, where they are attacking the 2nd Mississippi, which is taking shelter there, and threatening the right flank of the rest of the Iron Brigade. And so you can see a couple of flags from far distance. There are a couple of New York regiments that kind of participate in this, but it's been at 6th Wisconsin doing this. And they charge across this open field. They're losing guys left and right. Dawes writes about there's a constant stream of wounded men going back, or else trying to get off one more shot before they go back. And they capture the 2nd Mississippi. They save the Iron Brigade briefly. The contribution they make here is that it causes the Confederate attack west of Gettysburg. This is the first day of Gettysburg. And the day it started marching toward Gettysburg, and Dawes has this great passage in his memoir. He's feeling it, and people were, they're kind of swinging down the road, and the Iron Brigade was, kind of full of themselves. So, Pittsburgh's Crossing, which is that dramatic cross river attack, which is a few weeks before that. So I said, bring out the drummers, bring out the fifer. We're going to do, the Campbells are coming. We're going to pull out the play. We're going to go through Gettysburg, show off a bit for the people. And he said, certainly, no Confederates would dare to oppose such a fine set of men, something like that. Well, they don't get to go through Gettysburg because they hear firing. They're ordered off the road south of Gettysburg toward, again, if you know the battle, toward Seminary Ridge. Then you go beyond Seminary Ridge. And this railroad cut is very near the Chambersburg Pike, which is one of the major roads leading to Gettysburg from the northwest. This is their moment at Gettysburg. Dawes talks about the rest of his life. If he talks to veterans organizations, he writes a separate article about it. And they lose half the men. They go into it with 250 men in the regiment, plus about 100 on the brigade guard. And I don't really know why they do this. Like 20 guys from each regiment are added to the 6th Wisconsin. Don't know really why. They never explained what the function of the brigade guard was. But so they lose about 175 guys altogether, killed and wounded. And they spend the rest of the battle on Culp's Hill. Again, not important that you know that. They're not heavily engaged. Most of their fighting takes place over the course of this 45 minutes at the railroad cut. On July 4th, Rufus Dawes' 24th birthday, 24th, 25th birthday, 24th, I think, they go around burying bodies, which is what every unit does after every battle. And so that is the battles early in the war, the first half of the war, is a very brief summary, what their role was in those battles.
Did Dawes physically himself capture that flag, and is it still?
No, Frank Waller from Vernon County captured. He had the only Medal of Honor in the 6th Wisconsin. Captured the flag. They really were into capturing flags and protecting flags from being captured. And I think almost all the Medal of Honors given, and there are lots of them during the Civil War, were for capturing flag. Because flags were pretty important. They were symbolic. They also
So is that flag still in existence?
I think it's at the Veterans Museum. Unless they give it back. I don't think they gave it back. But there was in the 1890s, they were giving flags back sometimes. But I think it's at the Veterans Museum. I've not seen it, but I'm sure it is. So, home front. So I'm just going to touch on this. The Crescent, that's something well, Crescent called this, very early on, had lots of ads that used military terminology to advertise for stores. So, a grand forward movement, Gerard Penlock, which I think is a dry goods store. Reinforcement received, meaning more stuff is coming to sell. A great battle commences against high prices. I don't know, something like that. And they advertised for one of the first dime novels to come out about the war, but my novel. But there's also a lot of other references to home front activities. And so a lot of this is about raising money. Amateur musicians give a concert to raise money. A panorama comes through town as early as October. You know what a panorama is? It's like a series of giant paintings that unspool, across the stage. And the good ones have music and a narration and maybe some scenery in front. The first one comes to Wisconsin in October of 1861, Willis's Panorama of the War. Not much war to be talked about by that time, but they had it anyway at Adkins Hall. In November, the first year, the Florence Nightingale Union Society, Florence Nightingale had become famous through the Crimean War in England. The war was in England, but English soldiers were being cared for. They advertised a new song, the Vacant Chair, which is a very famous old Civil War song that came out during this time. It's not funny, it was funny now. At the time it wasn't. In early fall of 62, there's a major Indian conflict in Minnesota, which you might have heard of. It becomes called the Dakota War, Dakota Indians. They get treated unfairly reservations, and they just rise up. And it's a pretty bad massacre. Over by New Ulm, and Cato was kind of the center of most of the violence. But there are still Native Americans in Wisconsin. They're mainly on reservations, but not necessarily all of them. And for about a week, even as far east as Appleton and Manitowoc, there are rumors of Indians rising up and massacring people. And they're serious about it, although the Crescent thinks it's pretty fun, And so this is going on even as 6 Wisconsin is fighting its first battles. And really taking they find, I think outside Appleton, there's a camp of Indians who've been hunted, and they're having a deer or something. And so they become a war party, everybody thinks. And so it's pretty silly. And so forth. Well, I want to talk about, I said my last part of the talk, 2 guys who represent, for the 6th Wisconsin, the long Civil War, 2 very different ways. So I'm going to start with Joseph Marston, that you've heard about. When he died, he was called one of the most prominent men in the Fox River Valley and one of the pioneer settlers. Having arrived in 1952, he married before, remained in Appleton the rest of his life, except for when he was fighting the Civil War. So he is, as I've already said, one of the very first enlistees in the 6th Wisconsin and Company E, commands Company E for much of the war. He's kind of a hero at Gettysburg. Dawes, in his memoir, writes about a lot. The 6th Wisconsin, I think, had 3 captains killed, 3 or 4 wounded out of 10. Marten was not, well, he was wounded a little bit, but he survived. And so Dawes wrote, every officer proved brave, true, and heroic in encouraging the men to breast the deadly storm. I noticed the motions of our tall sycamore, he called him, Marten, was he really tall? Do you know? Was he a really tall guy? He was kind of angular and skinny. But anyway, what the way Dawes described him is during the movement against the railroad kept his arms out like this, urging his men forward. He said his long arms were stretched out as if to gather his men together and push them forward. At a crisis, he rose to his full height, and he was the tallest man in the regiment, so I guess that, excepting one other guy who was killed in the charge. How the rebels happened to miss Captain Marston, I cannot comprehend. Well, Marston comes home in 1864. He's disabled. I'll get to this thing here in a minute. But he was always at the forefront of veterans' activities. There was a for July 4th parade in 1865 that he organized. It was supposed to welcome all the soldiers back. It got rained out and was never held. But he was the guy kind of at the forefront of that. Anytime there was, again, a GR event in Appleton, he'd be part of it, give a talk or so forth. He was very interested in making sure all the Civil War soldiers from Outagamie County were recognized and that their burial spots were known by people. He was one of 4 guys that, in fact, led the design and funding for the monument to the 6th Wisconsin at Gettysburg out by the railroad cut. He was so well known, of course he was mayor a couple of terms as well. He was so well known and so respected that he had a barge on Lake Winnebago named after him. The only one in the regiment has a boat named after them, as far as I can tell. What you have over here, though, is part of this pension file. I talked about pension files. This is a really nice looking affidavit. And so this is actually an affidavit from James Jerome Watrous, who was a comrade of his, giving evidence about why Marston should have a pension. And the emphasis was on not only being wounded twice, he was shot slightly in the knee in Antietam. He had some mini balls and bullets that were brought by one of your neighbors, and that's what would have struck Marston in the knee. Luckily, he didn't have any bones, or he would have lost the leg. He was also knocked over by a shell blast at Gettysburg in days for time. He was also briefly a prisoner of the Confederates, but not for very long. But his main complaint was persistent respiratory problems. And so here's one of those things. It's not a wound. It's not his imprisonment. But he got a cold on the way to Gettysburg that he never loses. Clearly it's asthma or something like that. A doctor kind of says that eventually. And so it's not some of his really visible disability. He didn't lose an arm. It's easy to prove you're disabled when you have an empty sleeve or a crutch. But when you have respiratory problems, everybody has respiratory problems. Well, eventually most people get, I think I mentioned before, dysentery, rheumatism, or asthma, or what you have problems with as you age. And there are these long-term effects of these diseases on people. When he was discharged in 1864, Watrous, in this affidavit, said he was so reduced from lung troubles that I never expected to see him when he left for home. He seemed to be dying. Watrous, who knew him before the war, they came to the war together from Appleton. He actually spent several months being treated in a Washington hospital. He briefly rejoined the regiment, but then he just couldn't manage anymore, and he did go home. The man who replaced him as captain of the company, Henry Garfield, agreed that the cough just kept getting worse and worse, and he did a little duty with the company, really after Gettysburg. So he's trying to stick it out. And in his own affidavit, in his application, he actually claimed that what his occupation is nothing, being unable to labor. Now, he does have a business, obviously, but he is permanently affected by the war in this way, both in terms of what his interests are. He's a very enthusiastic and reliable veteran, but he also has health issues that last the rest of his life, although he lasts a long time. He dies in 1920, at the age of 91. Survived by his wife. Survived his wife by almost 30 years. Watrous is a very different character. It's a different version. He was an Appleton Crescent assistant before he went in. He actually writes a regular letter to the Crescent, JAW. Most newspapers had somebody from a regiment writing to them during the war. And so he would keep people up to date with what's going on with their regiment and so forth. He actually is a quartermaster. He becomes an adjutant later on. He does a lot of staff work, although he's in combat as well. At Gettysburg, he has this great story he tells all the time. The mule train charge. He's in charge of the ammunition train for the brigade. And at one point in the battle, they're running low on ammunition. The four other regiments of the Iron Brigade are fighting like an entire division, it seems, west of Seminary Ridge. They're running out of ammunition, so he charges in with the wagons under fire. They gallop up, they hop out, they unload the ammunition, they open the boxes, they charge back out without losing a mule or a man. And he gets a lot of mileage out of that story. It's very dramatic. He's captured for a time, late in the war. Everyone thought he was killed. Then he shows up, and he's not, in the spring of 1865. And he comes back to Appleton briefly. His wife has died in the meantime. He gives up his two kids for adoption. Marries somebody else later on. And he ends up moving to Milwaukee. And Watrous becomes, I think, probably the most important example of the 6th Wisconsin of memory in the long Civil War. And he does it by, first of all, giving a speech every Memorial Day, someplace in the state. He's like Mr. GAR for Wisconsin. He commands the state post for a year. He has to have given hundreds of speeches about the war, probably the mule train, and so forth. He organizes things at the Gettysburg reunion in 1913 of both Confederate Union veterans. He keeps tabs of the Iron Brigade guys showing up. He is it as far as GR is concerned, and he does it mainly through publishing. He's a newspaper man this whole time. The Sunday Telegraph, which is a weekly, published on Sundays, if you hadn't guessed already. A soldier's newspaper. There are dozens of soldiers' newspapers published mainly for veterans, although they had regular news too. Telegraph was probably a 6-page paper. They have society news and regular news, but they have like 2 pages about veterans. So men from Wisconsin could send in news about what they've been doing, or reminiscences about battles and camp life and jokes they played and guys who died. Watrous himself wrote a little history of the Company E, saying who's still alive, which ones had died, this and that, and the other thing, with little opinions about them as well. He went on to serve as a paymaster in the U.S. Army during the Spanish-American War, and in the Philippines, for that matter, after that. And he lived until 1922, buried in Forest Home Cemetery. He's barely remembered now. Most people, he wrote big histories of Milwaukee and Wisconsin during the war. But he has his own monument. Really unusual for an individual like him to have a monument. In Hales Corners, Hales Corners is a southwestern suburb of Milwaukee. And there's a rock, it's a big rock with a small plaque to Jerome Watrous, put up by a women's organization. It was sort of a short-lived women's organization outside what do they call themselves? The Daughters of the Grand Army of the Republic. Did not last very long. The Sons of Veterans, which, again, you're into these things, they are the successor to the GAR. They still meet, in fact. And they just kind of remember Watrous and other veterans. And so from a life cycle of memory standpoint, Watrous has a whole works in terms of making memories and becoming a memory himself. And I want to end with what I think is, you know where this is? About 40 miles away. This is in Renzi Cemetery. I'm probably saying that wrong too. In Fond du Lac. And this is the only monument, soldier's monument, that I've ever seen like this. Now, you've all seen it. Yeah. one around here, you know. Usually a guy standing at attention or at arms or shoulder arms or whatever, the guy with the gun and the bayonet, kept the cap. These were mail order monuments. You could order from Vermont or New Hampshire, and every town had one. Confederates ordered from the same place. You could choose one from a catalog. And so the big fundraising was to get a pedestal and funding to put it up and so forth. This instead is a picture of a veteran, a statue of a veteran in the cemetery, and it's outside town. It's like one of the older cemeteries in your Bama. When you drive in, this is the main drive coming into the cemetery. And there's a little soldier's lot, as they call it. Maybe 20 guys were buried right by him. I think one's from the 6th Wisconsin. Up the hill, Edward Bragg's big monument with the Maltese cross and everything on there. It's kind of base relief picture. Bragg goes on to become a division commander. I mean, he's a general when he is in the war. And survives and goes to Congress and so forth. But this one is an old soldier visiting his comrades in the cemetery. He's got his hat in one hand and a wreath in the other. It's the most moving thing I've ever seen in a Civil War cemetery. And I'm just going to end with that. That's a cool thing, and it's nearby. So that's what I've got for you. Thanks for coming.